Clara. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I would love to. Hello, everyone. My name's Clara. I'm on the designer advocate team, and I'm excited to dig into this topic about fidelities because I feel like it comes up a lot.
Hi, I'm Tom. I lead our advocacy team here at Figma and come from the design side of things.
And I'm Katie Chambers. I'm an advocate here at Figma as well. And this is a topic we've talked about among ourselves quite often, and we get questions from customers all the time as well. When should I use FigJam versus Figma Design? Now Slides is in the mix, so we just wanted to have a conversation about when to use each of these tools together. So we'll start with that. Tom, Clara, when are you using FigJam? When are you using Figma Design? When should we turn to Slides?
I think from a very high level, if I'm doing design work, I'll be in Figma Design. If I want feedback on that design work, I might just invite people to the Figma file, especially if I know that they're literate in Figma.
Okay.
But if maybe they haven't used it before, I might just paste it into FigJam.
Okay.
And then have them, they can leave comments, they can put stickies or react or stamp on it. There's like different modalities that they can put as feedback.
Yeah.
So I might put it in FigJam.
Okay.
And do you find that where you collect that feedback between the two tools often depends on like the audience?
I think so, yeah. Like if it's a non-designer audience, and they want to leave feedback, I feel like a lot of them feel comfortable in FigJam to do so. I don't know if y'all have similar experiences.
Yeah, and also I feel there's also an interesting tie-in between both tools that has to do with comments. Whereas like if you're running a synchronous session, I feel like people are like writing things on the canvas or adding stickies in FigJam. Sometimes people end up communicating in like these like sticky chains where it's like a little thread of overlapping stickies.
Yeah.
But then if you weren't in the meeting and then you jump in later, it's like you don't want people to like miss this like random sticky that you added. So then it happens in comments so that people get notifications. That's just my observation. And like somehow it's like an unspoken.
So I'll be in FigJam.
Yeah,
and then
that makes sense.
if I want to do a more formal presentation, before Slides, I would keep it in Figma and just, do a slide deck and, put the frames next to each other. But now you can also just paste that directly into Figma Slides and then present those screens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you decide if it's going to be a more formal presentation or something you're just going to keep in Figma Design?
Probably the number of people in the meeting for starters. Like that's one signal that might help with that. If it's more than 20 or 30, then maybe I'll do a more formal slide deck situation.
Yeah.
But it also depends on if it's interactive or not. Like, if I want people to crit the design or give feedback on what I'm presenting, then I might put it in FigJam. Like I have like this little diagram in my head that I'd love to share.
Yeah, please.
In how I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
It's sort of like an axis where create a little axis here. And then for like a bigger audience. Yeah. So let's say audience, big audience, and then small audience. And then at the top of this axis, it would be like interactive.
Okay.
And then like non-interactive.
Interactive being you want more opportunity for people to like shape the outcome, add ideas, and non-interactive being maybe a bit more linear.
Yeah. I think so. And so, I don't know, mapping this out, maybe I'll put like Figma Slides, big audience, non-interactive, like Figma Slides.
Yeah.
Over here. And then small audience, interactive, maybe I'll do like FigJam over there. Like loosely. Yeah. I don't know if either of you think about it in a similar way.
No, I think that absolutely makes sense. And it ties back to what you were talking about asynchronous versus synchronous too. Because if you want to be interactive in a synchronous way, it feels like FigJam is a great way to do that. But if you need folks to leave feedback afterwards in an asynchronous fashion, it can be harder to aggregate that and get people into a FigJam file. So that's where comments in the design file might be an interactive way to get feedback asynchronously.
Yeah, and I think if the thing that you're working on is distilled down to being something that's like in the design realm, you often think of like things where you're diverging to figure out like all of the different things that are within the realm of possibilities. And then when like you're converging, I feel like that kind of aligns with like things that you might put in a deck where like, okay, we're getting closer to a solution. And then from an asynchronous thing, sometimes like coming into a deck and having a linear thing that you can walk through is a little bit easier for somebody to do rather than like the choose your own journey across this FigJam board.
Like infinite, you're just like scrolling through it, trying to figure out what's happening.
I wonder where Figma design falls in there for you. So it sounds like at the beginning you were saying maybe small audience, non-interactive. Like if you were sharing out in a crit your designs with designers, you might do that in Figma design.
Yeah, I'm trying to think where I would put Figma design. Maybe like medium audience.
Okay.
With interaction. So I might put it like right here.
Okay.
Because I know some teams like to host their design crits inside of Figma design.
Yeah.
Like some design teams at Figma, they do that where they'll create a branch and then have everyone come into the branch and be like, you know, crit on October 10th or something like that.
Yeah.
And then every designer who's present will create a page and put their riff on that page.
The riff zone.
Yeah. They'll put their own riff on each page and then they don't merge that branch. Like the intention is not to merge it, but just to keep it as like this linked artifact to the main file. And so maybe this medium.
There is something that's really nice about that because then like you might set up the work really nicely on the canvas for people to like engage with it, but you also don't want people to be precious about it if they want to riff on it. And so whatever happens in the branch happens in the branch, and you don't have to worry about like not having kind of like a view of what you went into the crit with.
Yeah.
Which is kind of nice.
Speaking of like being precious of work, that reminds me of, I guess, the fidelity that you present. Sometimes when I'm, creating something super polished, maybe people are less inclined to give critical feedback. So maybe that can help define what type of fidelity to offer.
Absolutely. Just thinking about the intention of what type of feedback you're trying to get. What's the goal of your communication? Are you trying to get that feedback? Are you trying to present it out as if like, this is our final design? Do we have sign off? Do we have approval?
That's interesting because it's not just about like the tools themselves, but like the fidelity of the artifacts that you're creating in each of the tools.
That's true.
And so like you talking about the polished work of like, does it make it harder for somebody to give feedback because it looks like it's almost done?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, if you're like thinking about like the IA of a page or the information hierarchy and you're not concerned about visual stuff, it could also invite somebody to like comment on the colors and visual stuff when you're just like, actually, I just need feedback on this, which might lead you to maybe using a less high fidelity / polished artifact to have those conversations.
There's also the element of like how long it takes you to do that though. Like for someone like myself, it would take me a long time to create something that feels high fidelity.
Sure.
Whereas when you have that design system and have the expertise, you might be able to throw together a high fidelity mock in a matter of minutes, right?
Yeah, I think one question that sometimes comes up when we're talking with customers is people use the term like wireframe a lot. And I find, I'm sure you can probably relate to this too when talking to design teams, is like you really have to ask, like, what do you mean by wireframe? Because the people are talking about like varying levels of fidelity. They might have a full-fledged design system where they're just leveraging patterns that already exist and putting together something that like looks pretty accurate to what it might look like in production. But then some people are actually doing like, black and white line drawings that are just like rough sketches. And I think if your true goal is to wireframe, I feel like it needs to be fast.
Yeah.
And so if it's fast for you to sketch something out or draw some boxes, and it can like be something that helps you have a conversation with other people, then it's like achieving that goal. But if you're creating this artifact that like you're trying to polish and be really precious about, there's probably, I think, more impactful places that you could probably spend your time. But maybe if it's just as fast to use your component library, then that like still may fill the gap of what a wireframe used to be. But it ends up being much more high fidelity as a result of that. So.
But then how do you prevent people from nitpicking that if they think it looks more polished than what you feel like you're trying to communicate?
I feel like some of that is just kind of developing a feel for like maybe sort of like the internal culture at your organization. Whereas like if everyone understands that these are established patterns and the efficiency gains that come from using things that already exist, then I think you're less likely to get questions about that. But if those patterns maybe like haven't actually been established or built out in code and they're like pretty new, then I could see where somebody might get distracted because they're like probably seeing that thing for the first time, and might have a lot of questions about like the aesthetics or like how the thing is going to function, which may not be the feedback that you're looking for. So,
or getting ahead of it while you're framing up what you're about to present, or maybe you can even annotate it and call it out like, hey, I know this is not part of the library, but just FYI, like keep that in mind as you provide feedback on it.
Setting expectations, like setting the guidelines of the types of feedback you want.
That reminds me of something about feedback in general, is I think that I think it's really important to create like an open culture where people like from different roles can come in and add feedback. But I also think that sometimes, and this gets back to your expectation setting, is if you're inviting people to add feedback, there can sometimes be an expectation that like you're going to address it, or you're going to get an answer. And sometimes like there may be things that conversations that person wasn't part of that you maybe made a decision about, and it's not that the feedback is not good, but it just might not be something that like you can address. And so sometimes I feel like there needs to be kind of like some guidelines that just like can be helpful to remind people that like, hey, not every piece of feedback is going to be addressed, and it might be feedback that like you actually return to in like a future sprint. It's just like out of scope for the current thing. So sometimes like think of I think adding feedback as like planting seeds, and it grows over time as like you hear similar feedback. But it doesn't always get like addressed in the moment, and I think that can sometimes be hard and maybe somewhat discouraging if you feel like you didn't get a response.
Do you ever set that in your context in your files? Are you like putting that somewhere on the file, or do you say it at the beginning of the meeting? Like, how do you communicate that to the people who are leaving this feedback?
I think you could say it at the beginning of a meeting, but especially asynchronously. I think if you're like, in Slack or whatever you use for communication, like sharing out that context, like please add any of your thoughts. Here's what, like to your point about the pre-read, here's what I'm looking for feedback on. Of course, feel free to add any other feedback, but we might not be able to address it. And then at least people kind of like, no.
That kind of reminds me of maybe the rituals that you put around these feedback mechanisms. Like if you have set engagement guidelines to engage with like a certain type of artifact, and that happens at a design crit that happens weekly, maybe there are some house rules or something like that have been set in place that are tied to your ritual. But I think it looks so different for every team.
Another conversation I want to have is FigJam versus Slides. So Slides being a relatively new product, internally we use FigJam for basically everything, and we have a lot of meetings in FigJam that now I'm kind of like, should this be a Slides presentation? How do you think about when a meeting in particular should be hosted out of FigJam versus out of Slides?
I might think of it in a similar framework as this, actually, because even before Figma Slides, I did like it when people created slides in Figma and then pasted them in FigJam. I think that interactive piece is helpful. Because someone could leave a sticky and that that's the time someone is giving you feedback and you can choose to address it live. But you also have the context of where you were in your presentation when they brought that up. And if you were to review that recording after, you can catch up like with the timeline without reviewing a Zoom recording or something like that.
I find too with slides in particular, if you're trying to do like the kind of the style of presentation where you might have just like a really simple statement on a slide, and it's like it frames up what you're going to talk about, and then most of the content, that tend of presentation, like I'm very comfortable with like it being presented in like a non-interactive linear way, if that makes sense. But then you have these things where somebody might actually be presenting like some pretty nuanced charts and graphs, or there might be a little bit more content to digest, and that's where like that format that you were talking about, historically we've often like pasted a bunch of slides into FigJam, but like you also could do it in like grid view in slides. And I find it really helpful to just be following somebody. And if like it takes me a second to just like actually wrap my head around what's being presented, it's so nice to be able to kind of go like, I'm going to sneak back to like this previous slide and spend a bit more time with it.
I like that a lot.
Because I think I struggle sometimes like in real time to go through everything and then to formulate all my questions. And so there's just something about like being able to control the pacing a little bit, even if the presenter's going to keep going. So
Although on the facilitator's end, it can be a little bit hard when you feel like your group is all over the place and not focused on what you're talking about at the moment.
Yeah.
How do you thinking on the other end of that as a facilitator, how do you keep your group with you instead of, losing them to the distraction of what else is in the board?
I think that's a great consideration for choosing which medium that you want to use. If you have a really specific narrative that you want to tell, and like there's this story that you want to tell with like a specific timing, maybe slides is your better option. So you can bring them along and seeing what you're seeing. But sometimes you need people to like, go back and reference other stuff. Like that's me. I need to like look back again and see what happened. When you're choosing between low, medium, I feel like we should talk about medium fidelity too, and high fidelity. You might be trying to accomplish something. You might want to get feedback like we've been talking about, or you really want to sell a vision that you're really convicted about. I had heard one of our teammates on the design team, they were saying, sometimes a designer, even early on in the project, they'll prepare something really high fidelity, like a really beautiful prototype, because at some kickoff meeting, they just really want to nail that vision and sell it and sort of get people on board. So it's a little bit of, I guess, like an influence type of intention. And I guess in that case, maybe it can be appropriate, but you have to weigh the trade-offs for the time that you have spent on a very early idea to create something that polished. So, every project will be different. Maybe you don't have the luxury of that time all the time, and that's okay.
yeah, I can think of definite situations where like you have these constraints, like your roadmap, you're working on this thing, and maybe you've kind of aligned on a way of going about solving that problem. But I could see scenarios where like, as you're doing the exploratory work of figuring out how to do something, you might have another idea that maybe like deviates a bit from that, and maybe that requires like additional design or engineering resources. But like to your point, if it's something that like you have a ton of conviction, and it means that like it's not just like it goes beyond presenting a solution to this one problem, it's like now I actually have to persuade or convince somebody that like this is a avenue that we should approach and invest in. Then it's kind of like probably not enough to say like, here's this quick sketch of this other idea that I have. You might have to like build a higher fidelity prototype or put that presentation together that actually gives somebody that context so that you can kind of like sell them on that. And I know internally we do like our hack week called Maker Week, where people present like everything from like very polished ideas to just like quick things that they built a prototype around, whether that's in Figma or in code. And sometimes when someone just presents like what they did, it's like a cool idea. But when someone adds the context of like why it's impactful to users and how it can benefit this other thing that we're doing, it tends to just, I feel like, build a lot more of that like excitement and momentum around the idea.
And I feel like you also need that visual to really sell home, because I feel like can be that gap of the idea you have, and it's so clear in your mind of what you think the idea is and what the output could look like, but there's that gap with what someone else perceives, and if they don't get the idea, you need to communicate both the why and why that feels important, but also really sell the vision of what that could look like. And that's where that higher fidelity prototype might be much more impactful than a wireframe or just some sketches.
I also feel like sometimes there's like just really hard ideas that just require that extra little bit of like time to think through like how it's going to work. And it might not be like a super visual thing. Which those are, I think that's like a level of fidelity that I think there's a little bit of like a chicken and the egg situation where like when I think about like creating something on the Figma canvas, as a visual, people can understand how certain interactions are going to work, even if you just built a click-through prototype or something. But then you also get things like, this is kind of a meta example, but like if you think of like working in Figma, there's a lot of these like little like heuristics that happen on the canvas and canvas-based interactions where it can be hard to sell the idea until somebody feels it. And that's tricky because now you have to kind of like, it might be going beyond like what you would do in a design tool. You kind of just have to like build it and try it and feel it. And then it's kind of like, wait a second, like how do I get like engineering resourcing to like bring this up? Because like when I think of like the spectrum of like fidelity, like some of it might be actually going in and building real code prototypes to validate an idea, and that's like you said, maybe requires that like high polished deck to like please help me on this idea.
Can I confess something?
Absolutely.
There's like some tactics to what you were talking about when you make something really high polished because you feel really convicted about it.
Yeah.
In previous roles, if there was one idea I really loved, there's like some psychology things that I would do to make that the most desirable option. Like, showing 3 options and then maybe showing the best, your favorite, as the third one. So that's the last impression. Because if you're sort of framing it like, hey, choose one of these options and you want them to choose one of them, you might like put it in a specific order. If you want to add like fun animations or just like things that make it look more attractive, you might do that. And then a couple of other things that like mentors have taught me is if you don't want them to nitpick on visuals, maybe use like Comic Sans as the typeface so that it's super clear, like, hey, this is not high polish, like tear apart everything else about it, but not the visuals. Or when you're like even sketching out an idea, I'll put like a really ugly color, like a brown color or something. Not that brown is ugly, but like it's just super clear that that's not the final color.
Yeah.
So those are just like some things that I've done to help guide them with the considerations with a little bit of my preference like inside the options.
This reminds me of kind of a slightly off the beaten path thought from what you were describing. But if you think about like, I see a lot of designers working in the canvas where they're kind of like working on like an X and Y axis where they like keep duplicating the same frame.
Yeah.
And then at one point they're like, oh, I want to like try different variations of the thing. So they start like duplicating things down. And I'm a huge fan of this because it keeps this like record of like where you went and what you tried. And even if like 90% of that work never sees the light of day, there's something so satisfying when like somebody in a presentation kind of goes like, why didn't you try this like obvious thing? And you're just like, we did. And then you just like pulled this rabbit out of a hat and you're just see, this is why it doesn't work. And I think that just like illustrates that like there's just like so much evolution behind each artifact. And I think about this with developers. If they're only being engaged at the point in time where like you've like finalized a single screen or a series of screens and they see that, it can be easy for it to come across as like, oh, you spent like weeks just like fine-tuning these like 5 screens. But in reality, it's like 5 screens plus these other like 500 versions of it that you were just like riffing on to like resolve the layout or like the interaction patterns. And so keeping a record of all artifacts is key.
Yeah, and sometimes even sharing those too, like back to the option presenting sort of situation, I might put one as an obvious foil to the one that I want them to choose, just so that they know that you had considered that option too, showing like the breadth of everything you've explored.
Sometimes you just know that I know this seems like the obvious solution. Somebody's going to ask me about it.
So you have to present it
and you're just like, as you can imagine, first thing that we tried was this. And then you're just like, but for these reasons, it's out.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I think, and that's a good tee up when you want to present like just one idea that you have conviction on. You set the context with like some of the things that didn't work, and then you kind of like arrive at this place, which is your recommendation. And I think that's a good like way to build some credibility.
Yeah.
Kind of take them on the journey with you.
Yeah.
And help them come to the same conclusion that you came to, hopefully.
Hopefully.
And then also, of course, you can always have it in the appendix or the other pages in the file, just all your other explorations.
And speaking of an appendix, what's nice is that, if we could just link everything inside of each other. You can embed the Figma in the FigJam.
Yeah.
You could cross-link backwards, create like a README page, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just like linking everything is helpful.
But also being able to use all the tools in the same meeting even, or being able to drop your prototype right into your slides or have a brainstorm activity, alongside presentation slides that you're sharing now. I feel like then you can have all of those components that you need in order to tell that full story and have that full spectrum of fidelity all in one meeting, which is incredible.
I was thinking about this when you were drawing this chart.
Yeah.
Which is like, I think there's kind of like this, it's a bit of a different chart, but it's like the fidelity of the feedback that you want to get is kind of like proportional to like the fidelity of the artifact that you present to people.
Yeah.
And so when I think of a prototype,
I'll try to draw it.
Yeah, like a lot of people build like click-through prototypes.
Yeah.
But a lot of people also build like really high fidelity prototypes where there's like micro interactions and like people can fill out data, and like there's so many good use cases for all of that.
Yeah.
Asking yourself like, what do I need to prove out?
Yeah.
And what fidelity matches? Because at the same time, you also want to be like really efficient with your time.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to figure out like IA or some sort of navigation pattern to figure out like how a user is going to get from like A to B in a particular like feature or like navigate through your product, a click-through prototype that you can quickly link together,
Yeah.
even if the visuals aren't high fidelity, like might be enough to do that.
Right.
But if you're like trying to do a login flow and you want somebody to like type into the input fields and then you want to like validate whether their password is secure enough and all of these sorts of things,
Yeah.
my recommendation is always like, are you testing to see if your form validation is good?
Right.
Or are you testing to see if people know to type into an input field? Or are you testing to like the actual account creation flow and all the steps and user like information that you would collect to see if they can get from like point A to point B? And so, yeah, just being like real about like how much effort you put into some of those things, because there comes a point in time where it actually might make sense to like to build it and like test a code prototype or an alpha or a beta version of your product with customers.
Yeah, instead of prototyping the actual input for that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and also who the audience is for that. Like if you're showing executive level stakeholders, that's going to look a lot different than if you're putting something in front of a customer to get feedback versus if you're showing designers who are like in the weeds and know all of the nuances.
Well, that's just it. There's also the intent too, because sometimes people talk about like, we're building a prototype, and I think it's important to ask like, who's it for and what do you want to get from it? Because some of them you put in front of customers, but I've also seen somebody might like prototype a little micro interaction. When I click this floating action button, all of these like menu items reveal.
Yeah.
And that might not be something that you're building to test. It might just be building something to like, hey, I like, this is kind of like a sketch of how I want the animation to go. And that might just be like a conversation artifact between you and the developer who's doing the actual development of that thing. So
What do both of you think is a medium fidelity artifact? I have like some Frankenstein examples in my head, but I'm curious if y'all have created your own.
I think of like mock-ups, I think is in there, because like low fidelity could be like a sketch, it could be boxes, it could be placeholders, and then at the other end of the spectrum, like a higher fidelity thing, depending on what its intent is. If one of them's like a prototype that has to function and feel like the real product, that's obviously like higher fidelity than something that's just static. And then depending on what your next step is, if it's like going to get built in development, that could be like where everything is kind of like tightened up. You're using like all of the spacing tokens and typography variables from your design system. You're using auto layout, the design's responsive, it's annotated. But something, to me, the mock-up is like, it's something that feels real enough, but all of the fine details are maybe like not tightened up. And I actually think that there's something that feels kind of like the sweet spot of a medium fidelity artifact, in the sense that like, I think a lot of people get like sucked into worrying so much about the exact spacing and auto layout, and is this thing a component maybe too soon? And I think sometimes that can just like kind of get in the way of like you actually getting some visuals out the door to tell your story that you can get feedback on, and then it's probably going to change based on the feedback. So why not like tighten some of that stuff up later?
Yeah, that reminds me of one of the conversations we had during Schema 2021, where we were exploring this tension between freeform and structure.
Yes.
Where you don't want to get too caught in one side, but you also have to evaluate when's the right time to be on either side. So check that video out if you haven't already on YouTube. Really great keynote by Show on that.
Yeah.
For medium fidelity in my head, I don't know if it like people even do this, but you know, slap your components onto the canvas, and then maybe for something that doesn't exist, you just like draw it in. It's like a scribble next to an actual component.
That's kind of like a mixed fidelity.
Yeah,
that's cool.
That might be a better description. Yeah.
But I think that's helpful, because like if you're you're designing a mobile app, you know that like you might have some sort of like tab bar navigation.
Yeah.
And there might be something other consistent piece of UI.
Yeah.
And there might be a couple of things that you include that are high fidelity to like orient the user, like, oh, you're on this screen or you're in this part of the app.
Right.
And then the rest of it can be like, to your point, like a quick sketch.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to kind of like, oh, I know we're talking about this flow or, you know, this product area.
Yeah.
But the rest of it you keep really quickly so that you can just like iterate on it quicker.
Another fidelity level I think about is like the fidelity of a meeting. And so I think a low fidelity is like a team sync or something that's pretty casual in that way. So you're doing some prep, but not a ton of prep. And then your high fidelity is like a presentation where you feel like you have a strong narrative, you're ready, you're polished, your slides look great. And so the medium fidelity in that standpoint, I think is something where it's like a mix of interactivity and some preparation and information sharing, but then a lot of still space for exploration and creativity and interactivity. So I call that medium fidelity from a facilitation standpoint or meeting standpoint.
Now I'm wondering if there's a mixed fidelity version of
so.
mixed facilitation fidelity.
I think so, and I think that's where the slides FigJam combo is going to be the most powerful.
That's right.
Because you have your polished part of it at the beginning, you do bit info sharing, then you get into FigJam file and brainstorm and jam, and then you close out with some kind of presentation. Yeah, mixed fidelity.
There's still interactivity in Figma slides, so the polling.
That's true, and I try to make even the high fidelity presentations interactive still, but I feel like the medium fidelity is more freeform even than what our interactive slides allow for today.
That maps really well to like the diverge and converge kind of thinking, because I feel like if you are doing this like, I don't know, a really formal product review.
Yeah.
I know here at Figma, people often use the little alignment scale that people can go in and vote on.
Yeah.
And that to me is like you're presenting this vision. And it's like, are we aligned? And people might have some questions, but you're not asking people of just like, in a product review, you're probably not saying like, what are all the different ways that we could solve this problem, right? Like, and that's going to happen in a more scrappy artifact where people are like writing down actual ideas and riffing off one another.
Which goes back to the like big audience interactive, I guess. But another axis I think about is like high impact, low impact, and high formality, low formality. So that'd be like a high impact, high formality meeting. So you'd want to be like as high fidelity, as polished as possible. Whereas something that's more casual is lower impact. It's like at the beginning of the process, and lower formality. It's probably your team that you're very comfortable with. Everyone knows each other. So it's a lot lower fidelity.
I feel like the pencil tool in Figma or FigJam is like my way of saying like, here's a quick idea. Don't take it too seriously.
You use it a lot.
I
use it
always
a lot
use
in
it.
Figma,
Yeah.
which I love to see, like just this little chicken scratch inside of Figma.
There's just something about it where it's just like, we all know that this is a sketch and not a formal proposal. And I don't know, I kind of like that. And I guess, you know, historically that could happen in a notebook, but it's harder to share.
Right. But it's even you using tool choice as a way to communicate the fidelity. You're trying to communicate your ideas of like where you are in that process of like, this is very low formality. It's very
Pencil tool,
Yeah.
rectangles, frames, components, you know?
Even this little sketchy document, it's, you know,
low fidelity.
casual conversation.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that goes back to the original conversation. It doesn't always happen in a linear fashion. You're not always going to go from that low fidelity to high fidelity, and it goes every step of the way. You probably go back and forth between fidelities across that process, right?
For sure. And that you just reminded me of something that kind of gets back to maybe the mixed fidelity. And I feel like not everybody likes to admit this, but the amount of like designers that often just need to like screenshot the thing in production, paste it into Figma, draw some white boxes over top of the, or whatever your background color is to like block out some of the content. And then you start like doing the like screenshot riffing where like you're drawing new things on top of a screenshot. Yeah, but everybody likes to imagine that you have this perfect frame, everything's set up with auto layout, everything's perfect. But sometimes it's just like, I just need to like convey quickly how we might accomplish this to start a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I'm a huge fan of it, but not everybody like, I don't know. There's just something that's like very, the artifact is pretty sloppy.
Yeah.
but like it's enough
Right.
to react to.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes it's you could spend a lot of time like recreating
Yeah.
a screen or something.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a pressure as a designer to be higher fidelity more often.
I always think there's like a tension, and maybe this gets a little bit into the free form and structure conversation, where you slow down to do some of these like things at a higher level of fidelity with more detail.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to like accrue some sort of design debt, because it's like, I'm gonna have to come back to fix that thing later.
Right.
And which is like a fine thing to do if you're kind of like well on this path of like converging in on a solution. But like if you're just still trying to figure it out,
Yeah.
I think it's like, I personally would find it faster to just put something together quickly
Yeah.
and get reactions and feedback that set me on the right path,
Right.
and then go back and tighten those things up. I think that's okay.
Yeah. I really like what you said about using that to start a conversation.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's what you ultimately want. You want to gain alignment with the other people on your team.
Yeah.
Versus being precious about one specific thing that you made, which I know is hard. Like I felt that way, where I'm like, I labored over this one frame, this one like easing curve that I love so much, but you know, sometimes you just gotta let it go.
I think it does go back to the point about being intentional about what type of feedback are you trying to get and what's the most efficient way to get that feedback.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like we can try to like go about creating some like elaborate feedback mechanism when like you could just slap an alignment scale in there and get all the input you need, and then you can build off of the feedback you get in that alignment scale, like bring in each side of the spectrum. You're like, let's talk about this, and you don't have to over engineer it. So I do love widgets. It's kind of a shortcut for thinking about sometimes like what can be the most efficient way to get the feedback that you need. And sometimes that is a screenshot mock-up. Sometimes it's a high fidelity prototype, depending on how much you need to influence your stakeholders, I guess.
Yeah. And I think choosing the artifact is a skill that you have to refine over time.
Yeah.
Like I knew that earlier on in my career, I would just create maybe the wrong fidelity for that meeting. You know, maybe the meeting went sideways because I didn't frame it up right. And so it's like something you learn over a long period of time.
This brings me back to a story as well, where I had the exact same experience, where I was like kind of working in this like pseudo PM designer hybrid kind of fashion, tight on resources. I thought the right thing to do for this project was to create like this like product requirements document where I like outlined what I thought were the highest priority things for us to discuss. Meanwhile, I had started like sketching out ideas with the pencil tool of what I was thinking, and they weren't like super developed ideas. They were just like really rough visuals just to get it out of my head.
Yeah.
And I think I had put a link to that Figma file inside just like a written doc. We're all sitting in this meeting and we're all like engaging with the PRD.
Okay.
And then our VP of product like clicked on the link to see my sketches and was like, actually, can we all just like go into the FigJam file that's linked at the bottom of the screen? I think it's actually like a better visual to like have us discuss this thing. And I was like, oh my God, they're looking at like all of these like chicken scratch sketches that I did. But just having something that like was a visual actually like spurred so much great conversation that I feel like took the conversation further than words did. So thankfully I had the link to that thing and somebody against my will found it and it turned out, but yeah, going in with the wrong artifact and then not being able to get the feedback that you want, that's like, that's challenging.
Yeah. And sometimes words are enough too. Yeah, it just depends.
It depends, yeah. Yeah, I remember iRead's config talk from last year. They talked about this, of how they were trying to communicate in words. They're a copywriter here at Figma, and they were trying to communicate in words, and they just were not getting responses on anything. And they put together a quick mock in Figma for their idea and sent it in Slack, and everyone just chimed in with feedback and thoughts. It's like, sometimes it's hard to translate just words. And when someone sees a wall of text, like, people just tune it out.
Yeah.
As if you can just throw together a quick mock, you can break through that noise sometimes. it is something I feel like you get a better pulse on as you do it more and communicate, and also getting to know your stakeholders and what do they respond to.
And now that we're communicating a lot more asynchronously, sometimes maybe you have to do a voiceover of your
Just thinking this.
Yeah, you might create a video for that.
Yeah.
You might have to, I don't know, embed a video widget inside of FigJam, or you record, a separate thing and then you send it over some messaging channel. But I don't know, there's infinite options, and you have to weigh how long that artifact you want it to live too. Is this for this entire quarter, or is it just for this week? All those factors I feel like need to be considered.
The video walkthrough with a voiceover, I feel like is super powerful.
You're famous for that.
I love a little loon. But the thing there is I was just thinking of having a customer conversation last week. Person described this challenge, and I didn't have access to any of their Figma files. But the outcome of it was there was an area of the product where I felt that there was room for improvement, but it required no UI. It was just sort of a behind the scenes thing that I thought could work differently.
Okay.
And so I started writing a message to describe the problem.
Yeah.
I'm oh my God, this is going to be so hard for somebody to wrap their head around without reading it 3 times.
Yeah.
And so I recreated the problem in our product.
Okay.
And then walked through in about 2 minutes, what all of the problems that they were encountering with my own recreation of it.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a design proposal in there, or a change to the how it works part of design.
Yeah.
But I actually didn't need to mock anything up. I just needed to walk through why the experience was painful. And then once you understood the problem,
Right.
the recommendation is really easy to understand, and that is just words.
No.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if you have a similar experience, but there's many times where I think in the engineering world, what do they call it? Rubber ducking? Have you heard this term?
Where you explain it to a rubber duck.
Yeah. And so the amount of times where I've been trying to solve a development thing, and I typed out my whole question on Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
And then I guess you use maybe AI to do that now, but I was on Stack Overflow, and it was 100 years ago. And I was get to the end of my message, and then I read through for typos, and I'm oh, I already know the solution to this. Close tab.
Yeah.
And so that's the same thing that I go through, where I'm writing a message to somebody on Slack to describe this thing, and then I'm or you read it, and I'm I don't even know what I just said. It would be really good to have a visual. And then you you invest a little bit more time to create the visual, and it's
Yeah.
it's being mindful of the experience that somebody else is going to have when they consume your artifact.
Yeah.
And optimizing it for what's going to be the fastest way to understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Something you've been talking about a lot is just speed, both fast for you yourself to create it, but also fast for your viewer to consume it.
Totally.
I don't know, is that where we land on which fidelity to choose? Because I keep hearing speed coming up.
It's not like a pure quest to do something that's the fastest.
Yeah.
And oftentimes our stakeholders are very time constrained.
Yeah.
So I think it goes back to your audience and what you're trying to drive, and then knowing how your audience is going to perceive that, being empathetic to that. And often that's going to come down to them being time constrained, you needing to make it as easy as possible for them, I think. So I think that's where that speed comes in, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you might want to you might have an hour to sit in a room with your team and explore different options, and that's going to be a low fidelity because you have the space, you have the time to be lower fidelity. So, I think it depends.
Yeah.
One thing that you made me think of in all of this, the 2-minute real-time video walkthrough that you record.
Yeah.
Takes 2 minutes of somebody's time to watch.
Yeah.
The amount of times that I restart the video
2x
to re-record the video, and I know that sounds okay, you shouldn't be so precious about it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I found helpful is that kind of going through a few takes actually helps clarify my language.
Yes.
And it's a really good exercise for when you actually have to do it synchronously in front of a group of people.
Yeah. Yes.
You kind of got a bit more practice to just be how do I be really more concise with what I'm saying or what I want to get across. And so even though it feels frustrating in the moment, or my kid just dropped something in the background, or I tripped up on that word, 6 minutes, 3 takes to get the 2-minute video is it's okay.
No, exactly. when you were saying that you're writing that Slack message and then you're like, I don't even know what I'm saying. I feel that way. I'll write it and then I'm like, what is my ask? But then through that process, I find out what my ask really is and like what the most succinct way to share that is too. So it's like a personal learning journey.
Yeah, that reminds me of this quote. I'm having trouble remembering who said it, but that as a meeting facilitator, you're a steward of other people's time. And I think we often just like throw meetings on the calendar and like expect people to show up and just take that for granted. But like people are taking time to be there, and we should take ownership of that and make sure it's a good use of people's time. And I feel like we can do that by preparing, make sure we're ready to communicate in the most effective, efficient way possible. Yeah, it's hard and takes time, but I think it's worth the effort.
I feel that there's a thing with brainstorms in particular.
Yeah.
Where like, you want to time box sessions. Time can be like a really helpful constraint.
Yeah.
But if it's a really gnarly problem, I sometimes have this feeling like there's no way that my best ideas are coming out while this timer is counting down. And so I do think that there's like something about facilitation to capture those ideas where it's like you have to make it like we're going to do some of that work now.
Yeah.
But making it friendly and also setting some deadlines.
Yeah.
So that if people do want to continue, or knowing that you're going to come back to it so that people know that like, well, if I do add an idea tomorrow, we're going to have a chance to talk about it. But also not being open-ended like, well, thanks for joining. If you have any other ideas, add them to the board. And then you're kind of like, if I do that, are they going to look at them? And so I think all those expectation setting things are helpful.
What you were saying made me think, and I also resonate, like once that FigJam timer sound goes off, my brain turns off. Like I can't come up with great ideas when I hear the ticking, but that might just be me.
In our time-constrained world, it is harder to like make that space. I remember I used to participate in like half-day workshops or full-day workshops. We'd have like a full hour just to like get up and put post-its on a wall and whiteboard. But like that doesn't happen. Well, I don't participate in those types of sessions anymore. I miss that.
Me too.
And I feel like maybe, but at the same time, I felt like the facilitator was respecting it always felt like a good use of time. And I feel like that's the balance. Like you don't want to just have a workshop for a workshop's sake, but it would be nice to make the space. I feel like that's a balance. As a facilitator, you have to still make sure you're preparing in a way that makes it feel like it's a good use of time.
Another thought that you had when you're talking about being a steward of somebody's time is also like that context setting piece.
Yeah.
Whether it's a design crit or a brainstorm, maybe this tracks too when you have a bigger audience.
Yeah.
I find that when you have a bigger audience, there's like a much wider range of how much people have already engaged and are familiar with the project at different altitudes. And so I really like when, if there is some context that you need to understand like where we are and what type of feedback that we need, when somebody carves out a couple of minutes at the beginning of the meeting, either it's to present something or like watch this video or like read this quick thing.
Yeah.
It's really helpful because I feel like this is the time that I have to dedicate towards this thing.
Yeah, totally.
And I find if somebody says like, read this thing like an hour before the meeting, it's unlikely that I'm going to get to it. Right. So I like when that is kind of like built in.
Well, and also just creating an intentional space, even for people who have the context, like helping bring them into that moment, helping them come and get present. And that might be back to the medium fidelity. I feel like that's a medium fidelity where you're like starting off by sharing that context, by like setting some structure, but then also making space for whatever discussion is going to happen after that. But I feel like it is important to like create that intentional space together and make sure everyone's coming on an even playing, everyone's aligned at the beginning so you can go from there.
Yeah, and it seems like there's different facets to that. Like there's tooling literacy. So do I need to onboard people into
that's good.
Bring them in?
Yeah.
And then to your point, project literacy, and there's like so many things to consider.
Yeah.
I feel like this conversation is just getting more and more complex.
But it's so important. And it's something I feel like we take for granted. We just default to the tool that we have or the tool that we're most comfortable in. But when you get down to it, we should try to be more intentional.
Kind of like some of the underlying thinking behind like when people did, people still do, but like paper prototyping.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's just like bring the fidelity down that everybody feels like, oh, I can participate in that. Whereas like if you were like, all right, everybody, like jump into Figma and let's all produce these hi-fi markups with the components from a design system. That would be like an overwhelming task to somebody who doesn't work in the tool every day. And so
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, that comes back to what you were talking about at the beginning of like for people who aren't comfortable with Figma, they're bringing them to FigJam as a starting point. But some people like don't even feel comfortable, and you gotta make sure everyone's on the same page and feels comfortable getting in there. That's why I like to start with that easy entry activity where it's like adding a stamp or noting a sticky, where it's like very easy for them to get in.
Yeah,
They're pretty.
tip cards.
Tip cards.
Yeah, those are helpful. You're thinking of like you give them an easy activity, but it's like onboarding them to like a little bit of a new piece of functionality.
Yes.
And by the time you're ready for like,
The real thing.
Yeah. They're just like, they're using Command D to duplicate stickies across the...
Exactly. Was that progressive disclosure? But it's like progressive onboarding?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, start small and build up.
wow, we've covered a lot.
You've covered a lot.
How are we feeling? Anything else around fidelities we want to dig into? What's your favorite fidelity to work in?
All of the fidelities.
Mixed fidelity.
Mixed
Yeah, I knew, like,
And your favorite term?
I know.
title of the book that, Mixed Fidelities.
Yeah.
That's fair though. I think that's mine too.
We should call that the name of this
Mixed
segment.
fidelities.
Yeah.
A spectrum of mixed fidelities.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, this is great.
Great. That's a wrap.